So those are the issues that were surfacing, is even who gets to even call a land degraded, or to say it needs to be restored, or how it needs to be restored, or who needs to be invited to the table to talk about how it needs to be restored, or whether it does. That those issues are completely political.
Hey, I'm Michael Yadrick, the host of Tree Hugger Podcast, and I'm broadcasting from the land of the Puyallup people, also known as Grit City, Tacoma, Washington. This is the show where we reimagine ecological restoration, and the episode where we discuss a feminist political ecology of restoration. Before we begin, I have a proud announcement to make. The podcast is 2 years old. Happy anniversary to me. Happy anniversary, dear tree huggers. Kicking off in late 2019, the show has been focused on reimagining the practice of ecological restoration, unraveling some of the science behind restoration ecology, and highlighting some incredible humans and our relations that we share this planet with. I got mostly encouragement when I first told people about this twinkle in my eye for what would become Tree Hugger Podcast. I appreciate you all supporting this show over this time. Proud to say I still have the autonomy to explore and say what I want, and I wasn't thinking about 2 years down the road. I was pretty much just moving from exploring one topic to the next. And after all this time, I think our efforts still promise an equitable future for livelihoods and health spans in a just transition in a warming world. And I still endeavor to stay true to the original goals of the podcast, which were to educate about the foundations and key concepts of restoration ecology, make restoration relevant and accessible to the general public via podcasting, create a forum for discussion with a diversity of voices about current topics in restoration ecology and the restoration practice. My vow is still to include ideas from people of different genders, orientations, ethnicities, and colors than me. Lastly, provide information to young practitioners to help navigate their new study and practice of restoration. Here's to another 2 years, at least. We just hit another benchmark too. Earlier this month, someone downloaded the show for the 10,000th time. So that's right, 10K of downloads, so Tree Hugger episodes have been piped into approximately 20,000 ears in the last 2 years. Ultimately, I'm grateful to you all who are listening on whichever portal into podcast land that you choose, whether or not this is your first episode in your ears or the 33rd. On that note, if you love or even like the show a little, you can donate to the show right now. Take a beat. At the Tree Hugger website or in the show description of your app, there are a couple links to the mobile payment services. You can find me at my handle @myadrick on PayPal, Venmo, and Cash App. I am really grateful to folks who have helped already to defray some of my costs. Like $15 pays 1 month of syndication, which houses and distributes the show. And another $15 on top of that is for this cute software editing subscription. It takes a community to keep the podcast going. My guest on this episode is Marlène Elias, who is senior scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, and gender research coordinator for the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, program on forests, trees, and agroforestry. She leads gender research and gender integration in the Alliance's research and practice, with emphasis on strengthening the capacities of all staff to conduct participatory, gender-responsive research that will challenge inequitable norms and deliver positive and equitable benefits to women and men across food systems. Rooted in a feminist political ecology approach, her research focuses on gendered dimensions of forest management and restoration, local ecological knowledges, and forest and agri-food value chains, predominantly in West Africa and South and Central Asia. She holds a PhD in geography from McGill University in Montreal, Canada. An article from Marlène back in spring caught my eye that was also the theme of a special issue in the journal Ecological Restoration called Restoration for Whom, by Whom. She and her co-authors question who sets the sustainability agenda and urges us to pay attention to the power and politics that shape the values, meanings, and science driving restoration. They work from a foundation of feminist political ecology, which drills down on 3 pillars of power relations, historical awareness, and scale integration. For those new to the term political ecology, it sounds provocative, right? It is. Political ecology essentially investigates the political dimensions of human-environment interactions. Because human institutions infiltrate the natural world and wider nature affects human life and institutions, this complex and dynamic relationship has everything to do with justice, restoration, and other topics we discuss or hope to unpack on the podcast. I really respect their feminist approach to political ecology on how gender intersects with class, race, and axes of power to shape economic, social, and cultural institutions that influence how we make decisions and what actions we take to manage the environment. This framework situates us in histories of colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism, and how some people, generally women, are excluded from land ownership, fruits of labor, and other benefits from the earth. This has real-world impacts for exposure to climate change and the means of securing the necessities of life, our livelihoods. They urge us not to take the easy route on projects that focus on technocratic solutions, not to homogenize rights holders and stakeholders, to work through the history, relationships, and mistrusts that often lead to ecosystem degradation in the first place. I'm glad to bring you this episode about a more resilient form of ecosystem management and restoration, where we ask ourselves, restoration for whom, by whom? It starts right here. Enjoy my conversation with Marlène Elias.
I'm the gender lead at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. We're a research for development organization, and we work on a lot of what we do focuses on biodiversity and also other kinds of innovations that can transform food systems with the goal of improving people's lives. So even for biodiversity, it's very much conservation, but through use. And it should be something that is guided by livelihood principles as well. Most folks in our organization come from the natural sciences, life sciences side. And there's a few of us working on social issues within that. And we try to work together to bring an interdisciplinary perspective to the work that we do. Restoration is really at the heart of everything, very much about stopping degradation, but also sustainably managing lands and resources and regenerating as well.
That's perfect. I do apologize for not reaching out earlier, because I did read several of your papers in the Ecological Restoration Journal back in March and June edition in 2021. Sometimes it just takes me a while to wrap my head around an episode and like how a conversation with someone might evolve. But I've had this paper sitting nearby within like grasp for a while. This one in particular is paper called Restoration for Whom, by Whom, a feminist political ecology of restoration. I'm familiar with political ecology. Back in the day, I was a really big fan of like Nancy Peluso and Jesse Rebo, but I just had never really seen this intersection with political ecology and quote unquote restoration. I loved it. So I thank you for writing it, but it was part of this special edition in Ecological Restoration. So I was wondering if you could tell me how that came together.
Well, within I coordinate gender research for a research program called the CGIAR research program on forests, trees, and agroforestry. And I collaborate with colleagues who are part of other CGIAR research programs who work also on restoration, but again, sort of under diverse names. So even, you were saying you hadn't seen political ecology applied in a very explicit way to restoration. Well, much of the work that I've done before also is not necessarily called restoration, but the work is extremely relevant to restoration. And so is the work of these colleagues who were working under these different research programs. Well, we had been speaking for a while about doing something together on restoration that really surfaces the political dimensions. And so the three of us who are the two co-guest editors of the special issue, Deepa Joshi and Ruth Meinzendick, the three of us decided to do this together and to try to basically bring some of our colleagues on board, but we also put an open call out and we got quite a lot of interest. And we were also suggesting to put together a session at the Society for Ecological Restoration Eighth World Conference in Durban. So we met over there as well, and we started working together towards this this project and tried to be explicit about including people who were coming at the issue from different sectors. So we have some diversity of perspectives, but also the geographic diversity. So trying to have cases that would be from different regions. So it was an effort, but it was also something that I would say evolved pretty organically and that got a really good response. It's something that people were working towards, and just the opportunity to come together and to be part of something bigger and to sort of use this as a way to amplify our messages and to lobby together was appealing to those, to a number. There were 49 contributors in the end across 11 papers. And yeah, it was pretty painless, I have to say, as far as that.
That's super. And we will encourage people to read the papers. And it's some good reading. And it's so worth it. And they are open source, right? So they're available. Yeah. They don't live behind like a paywall. So that's what I love, is just that we point people in the right direction and people can find it. So you and your co-authors argue that restoration is dominated by natural science, which contributes to the systemic fault lines of restoration policies and practice. Can you tell me what you think are some important social and political dimensions of ecological restorations that are lacking on the global agenda?
Sure. Well, I think to begin with, I mean, what we argue in the paper is that even just the idea of who gets to define restoration, who gets to set the agenda, whose meanings, whose values, whose priorities are reflected in that is rather inequitable. And I think even since March, there's been quite a lot that's come out already, and principles also that are underpinning the UN decade that have had more explicit attention to social dimensions, which I think is wonderful. But often it's more about like distributional issues. How do we share the benefits? How do we ensure people participate in projects and so on? But I think even preceding that, there's issues around, well, who should even say whether they want projects or initiatives in their backyard and in their homes, you know, on the lands on which they depend and which they already manage. And then if there are these initiatives, well, who gets to define what their objectives are? And within the group, so often there's this emphasis now on saying, okay, stakeholder participation, and it's really a principle several authors and practitioners have tried to advance. So I think there are several issues. As I said, there's the values, there's the priority setting, and there's really this recognition of diversity and of trying to bring equity really at the center of the work that we do and of the efforts that we lead. And I think that the piece itself is also about really recognizing these multiple pathways and these multiple trajectories, you know, when we think about restoration and what it looks like, and opening up our minds to what it might look like in different places and to different people, and opening up possibilities for alternative visions and management practices and realities around restoration. So sort of subverting the top-down agenda that says this is what restoration will look like, and this is how we're going to implement it, and so on, to say, starting from the ground up, these million acts of restoration that are occurring and that you want to support and you want to put your energy behind to support those initiatives that are true to the lives and the values and the realities of the people who are managing them.
Love it. And really, these are the things we should be talking about, like this careful critique of sort of the dominant paradigm, especially when you're working on a worldwide initiatives that could potentially be affecting hundreds of thousands or millions of people's lives, right? So yeah, I do appreciate your voice on this. And one thing I did pick out, this one piece, something you all wrote. It says, in this narrative, and I think you're reflecting on the dominant restoration narrative, human nature relations are depoliticized and disembodied in overly simplistic framings. In all of this, the power and politics that shape the values, meanings, nature, and experiences of restoration remain peripheral, and the outcomes of restoration initiatives at best are uneven as restoration pledges touch down in diverse and unequal contexts. And my question is really how you think the dominant approaches to restoration intersect with gender, class, race, and how we can make them more prominent in our work.
Yeah, I think often they don't. That's what we're arguing in that passage. It's that often it's depoliticized. So we're trying to move towards a more interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approach to working with and on restoration. A lot of what we do is develop these technologies. The user is a little bit undefined. And so what we're saying is that there's contextual specificity to who the land or the resource manager is and what they want and what they can do with the resources and the capacities that they have and so on. So we're really trying to draw attention to that context and to the power relations that give them the freedom to choose or not, or that block off possibilities for them. And just saying, so if I take the example of the technology, I mean, the reasons why someone may or may not want to adopt or be able to adopt a certain technology is shaped by those power relations and those capacities in terms of access to resources, access to information and credit, and there are a million reasons why, and a value system that allows that makes those technologies fit or unfit for the context. So we argue that gender and other intersecting relations are very much sidelined in those approaches that begin with a very kind of technocratic, that come at restoration from a very technocratic perspective, where if you just have the right technologies, people are going to manage they're going to stop degrading their lands. And we're saying that's a little bit short-sighted, and that can do a disservice to people as well. I mean, we know a lot of initiatives, not only in restoration, but in the field in which we work, that looks at development and environmental projects that have done a real disservice to certain groups of people in particular. So often rural women or very resource poor farmers. And so that's a little bit what we're trying to challenge that, and to say we really have to understand people in places and the diversity of people and the power relations that in which they're enmeshed, in order to understand what people want, but also what they're able to do, to take up, and what makes sense in their particular context and position.
Yeah, I definitely can see that. And then dovetail with this kind of urgency, I guess, related to let's say the decade on ecosystem restoration and climate disruption, what it's doing to us. I could see where if the voices that are framing restoration in these different initiatives, if a default is a technocratic solution, combined with that urgency, it can really lead to unequitable outcomes, worsen the crises we're already in.
And it's not that those are ill-intentioned, but they're perhaps misunderstood or not. They're not digging deeply enough into understanding people and their realities and their environment. So, for example, initiatives that have closed off certain areas in order to allow them to restore, without recognizing that women may go in there to collect certain types of non-timber forest products or fuel wood, or that there may be herders who go in there to graze their cattle, and the all or nothing. So the exposures are very difficult for folks who depend directly on those resources for their livelihoods. So while we recognize, of course, the need to have certain measures in order to protect the resources, it has to be done in a way that respects the livelihoods of people who depend directly on those resources. So it's not to say that they're evil schemes or anything like that, but that there's a little bit of a lack of understanding often of those contexts. And in a case like that, it also goes against the logic of the intervention, in the sense of, if you're trying to promote something that's going to be sustainable and long-term and successful, quote unquote, however you define success, well, you're not going to achieve that if people are deprived of their livelihoods and therefore unable to abide by the rules or the measures that are being implemented or enforced.
Yeah. And as I was telling you before, a big focus of the podcast, like I'd love to dive deeper on about livelihoods for now at this moment that I have with you, but in the future as well, because I think I've kind of superficially highlighted it, but it's such an incredible foundation, I think, to restoration and land-based healing that's necessary at this time. So I do hope you can just provide some definitions for us, because this framework that you put forward is based in feminist political ecology. And I was wondering how it relates to restoration, and if you can tell us these pillars or these foundations of feminist political ecology.
So you were mentioning your familiarity with political ecology, which basically looks at the politics of environmental management, or basically takes a political economy lens to understanding environmental management. So how politics, social factors, economic factors shape environmental management. And feminist political ecology just brings gender relations, but also gender as it intersects with many other factors of social differentiation, which you mentioned some before, how that influences environmental management, how that influences people's relationship to their environment, to nature, their understanding of nature, their capacities to manage the environment in a certain way, to their social position, so who they interact with in those processes, what are their rights and their entitlements and their responsibilities, and so on. And feminist political ecology has just a huge range of issues related to environmental management from a political perspective, placing gender at the heart of that and power relations at the heart of that understanding. So it's looked at social movements, it's looked at environmental knowledge, indigenous and local knowledge systems, and so on. And we draw out 3 pillars, as you call them, as we refer to them in the article of feminist political ecology, that we think are often not receiving the attention that they deserve when we think about restoration and as restoration initiatives are created and implemented. So we refer to history, so to really understanding not only the ecological history of a place, but the historical relations that have influenced resource and land tenure patterns. So a lot of context, there may be a colonial history that influences the distribution of land and people's rights to land and to various natural resources. There may be overlapping claims to land. For example, herders and agriculturalists and other actors who may be using the same land. You were mentioning green grabs, and understanding the history of the place and of the people who inhabit the place. We talk about scale, so moving up and down, if you will, from the individual, the body, to the household, the community, and outwards towards the nation and the country, the region, the international arena as well. We're talking about the UN decade, which is framed at the international level, the global level, and how that touches down in very local places. And then we talk about power relations as the third pillar, but really at the heart of political ecology analyses is understanding how those power relations situate people with regard to others and how that influences how they manage resources. So those are the 3 aspects, under-recognized but extremely important for conceptualizing, implementing, learning through restoration initiatives.
That's good stuff. Yeah, I love it. I have some other questions for you that are in front of me, but you said this word entitlement. I think you probably are pretty well versed in it. While we're at defining things, I do remember in my graduate research doing a deep dive on research and just how fascinating it is, how certain people and their power relations and historical context, like how they mobilize entitlements or how you turn entitlements into access and benefits from resources and things like that. But I don't know if your kind of traditional restorationists are familiar with that term. Could you talk more about it at all?
An entitlement can be related to a right or principle. So it can be formal. And then there's also in the informal space, in the customary space, there are various ways that we want to be understanding or thinking through what people are entitled to in different contexts. That's also coming back to your question about these intersecting social dimensions and to what extent are they understood and accounted for in some of these restoration initiatives. And that's again what we're trying to say in the article, is that you really do need to understand how people are entangled or embedded in these networks, and how they're positioned based on all of these factors in a certain place at a certain time, in a certain system of norms and value systems, as well as the more formal side of legislation and so on, and how all of that shapes their decisions and their capacities when it comes to land and resource management. And the power being at the center of that, power relations being underpinning all of those possibilities and those capacities. It's power relations that create these systems of someone being entitled to someone else's labor, or someone having access to land and control over land, rather than a man having access to that land rather than his wife over land, whereas women's rights to land are often mediated by their relationship to men. Again, that's very context specific, but many parts of the world, that's, it's in patriarchal societies, men may have primary rights to land, and women may have access to land through their husband or through a father, rather than in their own right.
Right. Definitely. And so I can see where restoration projects are unleashed with sort of these norms, just like assuming these norms are embedded and can't be changed, right? That they can lead to some shortcomings.
Just to say that projects also reinforce norms. So if you've got a project coming into a community and saying, okay, let's get all the men heads of household together and let's decide what to do with this land. And they can come up with a great plan, and then that reinforces their decision-making authority over that of other members of the community, even though the land may be land that is primarily used not by them, primarily used by their wives or by other members of their community. So, no project is apolitical. And that's very much the heart also of what we're saying, is there's every step along the way is political and has implications, involves winners and losers, if you will.
Right. So I think that's a good segue into my next question. Do you have something in your mind, that a good or better example of some restoration initiative that takes into account these power relations, or the history and the scale?
Well, one example from the special issue is the one that is where the lead author is Lynn Lee, and she's written it with many co-authors from Parks Canada, but also from the Haida First Nations community. And it's an example of restoration work on a kelp forest in the Pacific. And it's guided by the values of the Haida First Nations community. And it's a co-management project. But because the community is at the heart of defining the project, the paper refers to this Indigenous framework for ecological restoration and explains these 6 different principles that guide the whole initiative, from respect and interconnections and balance and giving and receiving. So it's really conceptualized in a whole other way. It's really the community that comes up with the framing, and the project is built out around a whole other seed, a whole other starting point that reflects local belief systems and values. And the authors explain in the paper, it's fraught with challenges and some tensions and conflicts. The process is not always easy, but centering it on that belief system, those values, was really a way to allow the co-management initiative to overcome some of the historical conflicts and tensions, to work through them rather than sweeping them under the carpet, but to try to work through them to come to an agreeable place in terms of environmental management. So I think that's a nice example, and one that could be referred to in order to try to see what could restoration look like if it were guided by a value system that is not necessarily imposed by sort of quote unquote modern scientific principles, but there's an emphasis there too on trying to bridge knowledge systems, trying to learn, trying to dialogue, trying to bring these different ways of knowing the world together.
Yeah, I love it. So it's this article by the lead author was Lindsay Lee
Yeah.
about the ecological restoration for people and place in the Guianas. There's like a dozen authors on here, so it's indicative of like some sort of bigger, wider cooperation on the project and then explaining or publishing co-authorship of the project. So it's cool. Yeah,
Mhm.
I'll point people to this one. And I do appreciate not holding restoration in this apoliticized pedestal. It's important for restoration practitioners or everyone involved to sort of disentangle the conflicts that led to the degradation to begin with. And so that also involves court challenges and civil disobedience and different sorts of local and indigenous governance and past or ongoing reconciliation discussions, things like that. They're all really intertwined with restoration.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about whether it's land or other resources, but I keep coming back to land because for rural communities that depend on land, like that is the most fundamental resource for agrarian societies. And restoration projects basically, they take land that is, as you say, quote unquote, degraded, try to restore, regenerate it. And in so doing, it's saying, taking something from a state of lesser value into more value. And the thought that would not be a political process. That can't be the case. There is such a thing as a designation of land in many country contexts. It's actually called a wasteland, but it's lands that people use and that they go and collect non-timber forest products from or graze their animals or, so calling that a wasteland and saying it's up for grabs and we're going to make it better and not thinking about what that means for people who already use it, because that use is often invisible when you're not very careful about use rights and livelihoods. You might not even recognize that people are using that land. Or if it's the most marginal folks who are using the land, they may not even be invited to the table. So you wouldn't even hear of the importance of the land or the ways that it's being used. So those are the issues that were surfacing, is even who gets to even call a land degraded or to say it needs to be restored or how it needs to be restored or who needs to be invited to the table to talk about how it needs to be restored or whether it does, that those issues are completely political. We can't ignore that and assume that we're going to have a positive effect on the environment or the people who depend on it. We all depend on it. I mean, whether it's a proximate dependency or a more distant one, but especially for those who directly and are in proximate contact with those environments and those lands and those resources, they need to be at the center of these discussions and not peripheral and not the last ones consulted, but their values and priorities and visions for how those resources are to be used and managed need to be at the center of that whole agenda.
Right on. Exactly. Yeah. And I think you started to answer my next question, which is just how we can move restoration more towards resilience. And I think you have a particular conception of resilience restoration that you've read and talked about that really engenders better social inclusion. Can you just give us some tips about best practices or places we could go to figure out how to do this?
After this issue, the authors of the contributors to this issue came together and we were discussing how do we bring this forward now and how do we disseminate the issue and the issues that it deals with. And we actually produced another paper called 10 People-Centered Rules for Sustainable Restoration. And it's been published in the journal Restoration Ecology. And it's really very action-oriented piece. This 10 people-centered rules is really a call to practitioners and researchers and decision makers to heed some of the lessons learned from, if you will, from this special issue. And so, I think that's one place you could look. We refer to sustainable restoration, but I think it's very much placing resilience at the heart of thinking around restoration. And by sustainable restoration, we really refer to creating the institutions, the right contextual factors to be able to have the sustainable management practices rather than to having these externally defined initiatives remain indefinitely. But it's about how do we create the right institutional context to be able to avoid degradation, to sustainably manage resources, and to restore, to regenerate those that need to be regenerated. And it's really about reframing restoration from an environmental pursuit to one that really places people at the heart of the issue or the process.
I love it. I love top 10 lists. I don't know if that was in your mind. It's like top 10 lists are just good takeaways, like good rules to live by that we should all live by. So
yeah, that's a little bit. It was a response to another paper. It lacked a little bit of the socio-political dimension. So we wrote this one in response to that paper, not to supplant the other rather, but to complement what was already in that paper that was more ecologically focused.
Super. Yeah, I will point people to this paper too, and we'll talk about some of these 10 rules. I think I could just lay them down for people so it gives a little teaser so they might actually go read it. There's actually an acronym for this. Have you seen Too Long Didn't Read? TLDR. For that? It's beautiful. No, this is excellent. I'm a reader and I want to go ahead and shame everyone else who isn't taking time to read because this is important stuff. I mean, obviously you and your co-conspirators take so much time, I guess, to write this stuff down and gathering all this perspective from like Western science, like you said, local people on the ground and indigenous wisdom. And you're just like, it's a great mashup. So, I mean, it's beautiful. A question I like to ask everyone, the name of the podcast is Tree Huggers. So we like to talk about our favorite trees. And so I was wondering if you had one you're fond of.
Well, I do have one I'm particularly fond of. It's the Chia tree. It's been a long-standing love affair with that tree, actually. It's one of the few trees that's left standing in farmers' fields and agroforestry parklands in West Africa in that Sudanian Sahelian zone. And it's really the source of so much nutrition and shade and ecosystem services. And women produce a butter out of the nut of the tree. And that butter is used for ceremonial purposes. It's used as skin moisturizer. It's used to anoint newborns and keep evil spirits away. I mean, it's just a tree that is used for everything. And that's really at the center of the cultural system there, and also livelihood systems. And women sell the butter, and it's one of the few economic returns that they get to keep under their own purview and control. And they also sell the nuts, and the fruit itself is very nutritious, especially for children. And the tree comes into fruit during the lean season when there's not a lot of other foods in granaries. So it plays a really critical role in that region for most ethnic groups. It's a tree that I love and that I did my master's and PhD thesis in relation to. And I actually had a fair trade shea butter company, and I also love the butter. So
Okay. Yeah, this is a great tree. Yeah, sometimes you don't think of ones that you don't see all the time. So hearing about this, yeah, in particular, yeah, it grows in West Africa, and it's like a super food and super provider to people and to wildlife. And it looks like that interesting thing about the phenology of it too. It provides when other things aren't. It's fascinating. We are highlighting you and your work and just trying to think of if people out there listening, this conversation really strikes a chord, or these themes really are fascinating to people and they want to learn more or seek to do the work that you're similar to what you're doing. How do you think people could sort of like tune in and gain the skills or just make a move on educating themselves more about what you do?
Well, there's the issue that we've been talking about. So that would be a great place to start, just to kind of get a better sense of what we've been discussing. So that's in Ecological Restoration, March 2021. And there are 11 papers included in that one. And then there's the other paper I just referred to, the 10 people-centered rules. that is also quite relevant. But I think a lot of the issues, they go beyond restoration too. They're really about understanding people in managing their environmental resources, being part of their environment, living lives that are not so segmented between humans and then the non-human world, depending on the context. That is more or less relevant to how people experience their lives and their world. So I think there's a lot of great literature out there that would explore these different kinds of perspectives and written by people positioned in different ways with regard to restoration and to their environmental management. The most interesting reading for me is reading outside of my discipline, or even reading outside of research, looking at poetry and literature and texts that are written by, as much as possible, people who actually are closer to managing and to using the kinds of resources that we're interested in, and understanding value systems and so on. Land, perhaps to us, is just a place to grow food, but that's not the case for most people who live off the land. I mean, for them, land is much more than that. And so just even understanding those aspects really affects the way you then understand restoration, and the way you understand the big issues, and where do we start and where do we go, and how do we open up these processes to having these different viewpoints and vantage points weighing in and influencing the trajectories that we, as in like the global community, really takes around restoration. And how do we open that up to those plural, those multiple visions, rather than having a more homogenizing view of restoration? So I would say, just reading outside of our comfort zones even, and trying to read and understand the perspectives of the multitude of actors who are involved in this, really brings us closer to being able to do something that is meaningful and equitable.
That's a lovely way to end the conversation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I'm glad we navigated through all the technical difficulties and they were able to connect somehow. Yeah, between Montreal and Tacoma. I learned a lot from reading your paper, and I learned more from this discussion. So I'm glad we can share it with people, and that you left us with some really succinct takeaway messages, but really leaving it open for people to explore more on their own too. Thanks for your time, and have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for more information about Marlène Elias, or you can find out more about her online at treehuggerpod.com. We are on social media at treehuggerpod, so please feel free to point people in our direction. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It definitely helps people find the show. Or tell a friend about the show. Or donate to the show, please. Join me on the next Tree Hugger episode for a story about climate disruption's impact on local tree species in the Puget Sound and the Pacific Northwest. I talked to some of my smartest friends and colleagues about what they are seeing on the front lines, what we can do about resisting loss of our most beloved tree species, and how we might cope when climate anxiety rattles our emotions. Here is a little taste. I've got this little corner store across the street, so I go over there every once in a while and grab something. And, a lot of times I don't buy my own local newspaper.
Well, that's pretty great. Man. I didn't realize it was a front page. That's
yeah, seriously, not exciting. The best photo. I mean, obviously it's like dead trees.
Whereas if we're talking about majority of the impacts of climate change are still to come. So we're kind of preemptively grieving and having anxiety about something that hasn't fully happened yet, but something that we can see coming down the pipeline in 10, 20, 30 years, and with these increasing impacts. Something that feels a few decades ago like climate change is something that we won't have to deal with in our lifetimes. But, if we look at projections out to 2050, I'm still going to be working in 2050. I'm still going to be actively part of the community and part of the workforce in 2050.
The music for the show you heard from Chia and DJ Freedom. One can find a link to them in the show description. Thanks for hanging out. See you in the woods.